It seems finally we're back to more face-to-face and in-person travel of very distinguished speakers, like this series has been renowned for. In fact, you know, the subject of today's talk is very much related to that, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on not just Egypt, but also quite a few neighboring countries around us, for which the wonderful effort of Dr. Ragui and the Economic Research Forum and the ILO had made it possible for us to analyze you know, particularly labor market outcomes in those countries because of all of the data sets that have been collected. That brings me to introducing, maybe he doesn't need introduction, who Dr. Ragui Assaad is. He's of course, the lead and one of the most distinguished professors, labor economists and data analysts in our region. He's currently professor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, where he also co-chairs the Masters of Development Practice program. And I should add that, you know, in the spirit of capacity building, you know, quite a few Egyptians and Arab students have been there visiting in Minnesota and obtaining this master's to work closely with Professor Ragui Assaad. So hint, for those who might be meeting him after that, if you want to ask him for something. He has, of course, his most impactful position on the region has been in his capacity as a research fellow and a member of the board of the Economic Research Forum for Arab Countries, Iran and Turkey, ERF. He has, while he was there, he led the human resources and labor research effort and strand there, but most importantly, he led the design and implementation of several nationally representative longitudinal surveys of labor market conditions in several Arab countries. And I'm proud to say I was a member of his very first team, I think we analyzed 1988 data. Maybe I shouldn't mention, no, forget 88, I was too young. 1998, but really, you know, 88 was the reason why you know, very personally, I should say, was the reason why I was able to finish a good PhD thesis in the University of Cambridge, UK. My real supervisor was Professor Ragui Assaad. You know, my other supervisor there was very nice, but he didn't know anything about our region and you know, the labor market in Egypt. And I'm one of his earliest.
She makes me seem much older than she is, but I'm not.
A few years difference. And we're both in our 30s, as you know. But you know, really, you know, I can say a lot about his research and what a prolific writer he is. But it's very profound. His impact as a mentor and as a friend to all his students. We were very honored and happy to have him here for a whole year as a distinguished visiting professor, where he taught a couple of strong courses that continued being taught by some of his colleagues and young friends, such as Rania Rushdie, on the analysis of this data. I can see quite a few students who learned from that, and he continues guiding his students, his colleagues, you know, publishing all those books about, for example, the Egyptian labor market, the Tunisian labor market, the Jordanian labor market, just a new edition, the newest one about the Egyptian labor market just came out. And he's continuously adding junior economists to this team and trying to pass on his passion about the analysis of labor markets. Dr. Ragui is, you know, he's amongst friends and at home here, not a visitor, and that's why I would like to very much encourage a very dynamic interaction. You know, consider him a professor here. You know how you stop us when you don't understand something, when you disagree with something. Feel free to do that. We want it to be a lively discussion, but because there are so many of us, and I'm so happy about that, and so many people online, we have put some. You know, also notes if you feel more comfortable writing a short question, and we will collect those, and I will try to moderate at the end some of your questions. But if you feel like raising your hand, that's also possible. And somebody, Dr. Dina herself, will also be looking at the questions on the chat on Zoom. Very happy that you're all here. And without further ado, Dr. Ragui, please start.
Thank you so much, Mona, for this lovely introduction. It's always feels like coming back home to come to AUC. It's nearly going to be 5 years now since I was here as a visiting professor in 2017-18. So it's lovely to be back. It feels like home. So I'm going to summarize some research today that we've been conducting since pretty much the beginning of the pandemic on the effects of COVID-19 on the labor market in MENA, which was accompanied by a major data collection effort carried out by ERF over the past couple of years. So let me, and as Mona said, please feel free to, especially clarification questions, if you want to ask them at any point, I'd be happy to take them, and then we can have a more intensive discussion later on. So basically, the experiences of different countries of the region has been quite varied as a result of COVID. The intensity of the pandemic varied a lot from one country to the other, as you will see in some of these graphs. The responses, the public health responses, the closures that the countries took were quite different, and the consistency of these closure policies was different. It had a very different economic and labor market impact on the various countries' economies, but also the social and economic responses that were taken were different. So what can we learn from all of this? We want to know how different groups, in particular, how vulnerable groups were affected by the pandemic. And I'm going to look primarily at employment outcomes like employment, unemployment, being in and out of the labor force, as well as the hours of work, and finally, the wages and income and earnings of the workers. While my main focus is going to be on Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, these countries we have the best data for. We also have some data on Sudan. We carried 2 waves of the survey in Sudan. But as you know, there's so much other than COVID going on in Sudan. It's really hard to make sense of Sudanese data, given the very high inflation, the political instability, and the various other changes that are taking place there. So while I'm going to show some results for Sudan, I won't belabor them too much. The period of analysis that we're going to look at is from November 2020, which is when the first survey was fielded, to about mid of 2021, which was wasn't the last survey, but it was the last survey we analyzed for these particular results. So the talk is primarily going to be based on these 2 publications that one of them is published, the policy brief number 73 of under ERF, and the other one is about to come out, which is kind of a working paper that's part of a series of papers, thematic papers from this project. And then there are this is the 4th of 4 policy briefs that is listed here that came out from this project. And then there are also country studies for Morocco, Egypt, and Tunisia, which are about to be published as well. So there's plenty to go back to if you need to go into more depth into this. So let me talk about the main messages first. Clearly, we see that Jordan and Tunisia had a much more severe experience of the pandemic from a public health standpoint. And it is linked to some extent to the consistency of the closure policies and the public health responses that they've taken. They were both very strict at first, so strict that they could not sustain the closures. They reduced they opened up their economies early. They had huge surges in the pandemic, which resulted in further closures. And so they had a more turbulent up and down in terms of the public health responses. While all countries did deploy social and economic measures to support workers and households, generally speaking, these were fairly limited in size. I'm going to talk about how they relate to the size of the GDP in a minute. Compare that to what the worldwide response was. They also were limited in duration. In many cases, they were limited to 2020. In the case of Tunisia, they were limited to a couple of months within 2020. And then not that many workers were actually reached by these policies. So while we'll talk about response policies, they had a limited effect. Now, what we see from the results is that, the employment indicators have more or less recovered, in the sense there was a dip right at the beginning of the pandemic in most employment indicators, and then there's been recovery. However, income has been much more slow to recover. And so income shocks have remained until June 2020. We see significant persistent declines in income. As one can imagine, the most vulnerable workers, those who are informally employed in the private sector, especially those who are employed in a casual manner, usually outside of fixed establishments, and as well as workers in micro firms, household enterprises, were the most severely affected. And by the same token, the biggest income losses were among the poorest households, those who were poorest pre-pandemic. And we can see that as a result of that, the pandemic, like in many other parts of the world, has had negative effects on poverty and inequality. This is an idea of how the public health crisis proceeded over time. The gray line is the world average in terms of number of cases per thousand and number of deaths per million. Egypt is significantly and persistently below that line. While there's some suggestion that the number of cases are underreported in Egypt, the number of deaths are not so easy to underreport, and you can see that they do go up a little bit in early on in the pandemic and in early 2021. However, you can clearly see that Egypt is well below the other countries. Morocco is, in terms of the second best. It had a resurgence in both cases and deaths by the end of 2020, but then things came back down and remained so until the very end for Morocco. But what you can really see here is the big peaks in Jordan and Tunisia. Jordan had its peak in the fall of 2020, the first peak, and also in early 2021, and that translated into these huge increases in cases and deaths. And then Tunisia a little later, but still even bigger peak in deaths towards the second half of 2021. So these are the public health crisis. This is a chart of what's the so-called Stringency Index, which summarizes the closure policies that governments have adopted. These closure policies were all quite strict early on. And you can see the world average was very, very high. This index goes from 0 to 100. So they were all in the high 80s to low 90s, with Jordan in particular being extremely high at 98, almost adopted every single type of policy, closing schools, shutting down travel, shutting down workplaces, public gatherings, etc. And then you can see clearly that both Tunisia and Jordan loosened up significantly around May of 2020. Tunisia remained fairly loose until about September 2020, whereas Jordan, in reaction to the resurgence it had in the second half of 2020, started closing down again, became one of the strictest regime again by October 2020. So that fluctuation in public health response is in reaction to these surges in cases that you saw in the previous graph. Now, again, Egypt here is pretty much staying at the world average, steady, moderate and steady until about June, where it actually goes below the world average to some extent, and then remains steady and is a little bit above the world average towards the end of the year. But Egypt took a very moderate stand and steady stance on closures, and you can see that going to see that in the results of the analysis, where things remained fairly moderate in the case of Egypt. Morocco had a somewhat more strict stance at first, and continued to be quite strict all the way going to the end. So, that probably explains to some extent why they didn't get the same surges in cases that Tunisia and Jordan did. Now, Sudan, I'm not going to say much about, but you can see that there is a dramatic loosening in the stance starting in fall of 2020, and then it remained fairly loose with the exception of a couple of months in 2021. But there was so much else going on in Sudan during that period. Now, in terms of GDP growth, this is a chart showing the quarterly growth compared to 1 year earlier. So what you're comparing here is what the growth is relative to the same quarter a year before. And what you notice here is that Egypt started with fairly healthy growth in the first quarter of 2020, 4.4%. It was and if you extend that back to 2019, Egypt had a 5.5% growth, which is the highest among these comparable countries. While the growth went negative in the second and third quarter, it was a moderate decline in growth. But the average for the year, for 2020 in Egypt, was a positive 1.3%. And therefore, it never really went into negative territory for the year as the other countries did. In Jordan, in comparison, it started with lower growth, and then the average for the year was about negative 1.6 in Jordan, and then the recovery was somewhat slow, and you can see that it picked up only slowly in the beginning of 2021. For Morocco and Tunisia, you have, again, relatively slow growth to start with pre-pandemic, and then a huge decline in growth. So Morocco averaged negative 7.7% in 2020 as a whole, and Tunisia averaged negative 8.8%. So these are huge declines in growth. Now, of course, they recovered quite well in the second quarter of 2021, but that's compared to the very negative. This is compared to the very negative growth rates they had in the second quarter of 2020. So you can see that these variations in growth experiences show that at least Egypt and Jordan had a relatively more moderate experience in terms of growth versus Morocco and Tunisia. So what about the international literature, and what does it say about the impact of COVID-19 worldwide? I'll just quickly summarize here that early on, studies among many emerging countries show that about a third of workers stopped working. Overall, in this region, in MENA, this rose to 45%. So there was a big stoppage in work very few months of the pandemic. Among 16 low and middle income countries in which the study was conducted, it showed that there was a loss of income, some loss of income, in something ranging from 8% to 87% of households. So very broad range. Some countries had fairly moderate loss of income. Some countries had almost everybody had some loss of income. And the median among these countries was 68% of households experiencing some loss of income. So this is a pretty broad crisis that affects almost everyone. Now, there has been some studies showing a strong correlation between the stringency level at the country and the decrease in employment. I have to say that this is a result we haven't managed to reproduce that well in our data, that the link between stringency and employment outcomes is not all that strong. And it's possible because we have a lot of stringency on the books, but we don't quite enforce them as much. So that may be the case. Now, the groups that are marginally integrated in the labor market, and you can think of youth, women, low income people, self-employed, casual laborers, those groups have disproportionately borne the cost of the pandemic. They were the first to be affected and the last to be able to come back. And we will see evidence of that in the region as well. Now, as far as the ability to work from home, in the US, for example, as a reference, it's 1/3 of jobs can be done from home. In the region, it ranges from a low of 14% in Tunisia to 27% in Jordan. I was surprised at how high it was in Jordan, but a lot of public sector workers in Jordan, and they can apparently work from home. And then the two other countries are somewhere in between these two figures, closer to the Tunisia side than to the Jordan side. So not a lot of ability to work from home in general in those economies. Now, having kind of looked at the broader scene across the world, let's dive into what we know here about the region. We have this fantastic new data set called the COVID-19 MENA Monitor Survey. This survey was carried out by ERF in cooperation with the ILO for Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, and Tunisia, and with the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, which used to be known as the Department for International Development, which is the UK aid, and that was for the Jordan case. We had two waves of the survey in Egypt, February and June 2021. There was a wave that preceded that in July 2020 that was carried out by Basira on behalf of ILO, except the design of that wave was quite different from the ones that were corrected by ERF. And therefore, we don't include it in our analysis because it's really not very comparable. But you have a wave from July 2020 if you are interested, and that data is available as well. Jordan, we have three waves in February, June, and August 2021. Sorry about the extra digit here. So Jordan, the data collection started a little bit later, but continued till August. And then in Morocco and Tunisia, we have the most data, starting in November 2020, February, April, and June 2021. Sudan, it's April and August 2021, again, fairly late in the pandemic. Now, the data is collected through what's called a rapid phone survey, where you basically dial randomly generated numbers and you get significant non-response as people who don't want to answer, who don't pick up their phone. But at the end, we managed to get a sample of about 2,000 individuals who also report about their households. And we try to continue with this sample over time from wave to wave. But of course, because of attrition and people not continuing, you have to replace it with a refresher sample. And then weights are the weights that are used take into account the attrition and the loss of the non-response rates. One should keep in mind, though, that the universe for these data sets is households or individuals that own mobile phones. So it does not directly generalize to the entire population. So there are certain groups like rural women, for instance, who are not very well represented. And that's more so in places like Morocco and Sudan, where rural women have very low access to mobile phones. So keep that in mind, because some of the numbers may not be directly comparable to the national numbers that you get from the official statistics. Now, we also did surveys of firms, from firms, small and medium firms. The micro firms are included with the household survey, but the small and medium firms, size 6 to 199 workers, were included in a special survey of 500 firms each wave, and there were 2 waves of that in the first and second quarter of 2021. So all of these data are publicly available for you to analyze. They are on the ERF data portal, and I strongly encourage you to go in and explore if you have data analysis interests to go and explore that data. All right, so let's talk about some of the measures that the countries took to protect workers and households. We basically, you want to put a size on the social and economic responses. This includes all responses: support to firms, support to workers. It ranged from 1.8% of GDP in Egypt to 2.3% in Tunisia, to 3% in Morocco, and 8% in Jordan. So if those seem like big numbers, the global average was around 10% of GDP. And in advanced countries, it went well beyond that. So in terms of the special measures that were taken to counter COVID-19. So most countries, or nearly all countries, took the existing social safety nets and extended them and added either money to people who were already on the rolls or added additional households to the existing social safety nets. So for example, in Egypt, they added 14% increase to regular pensions. They expanded the roles of Takaful and Karama, which is a cash transfer program for the most vulnerable families. They increased the allocation through the food ration card system so that households could have more money to spend through that system. But as a new set of measures, there was a new cash transfer program that was essentially developed on the fly to respond to the plight of irregular workers, informal and irregular workers. It eventually reached 1.6 million workers out of a potential of about 11 million of them out there, with about £500 per month for a period of 6 months of cash support. But the lesson from this is it's better to have the safety net already existing when a crisis like this comes, you can immediately use it rather than try to create something new on the fly in response to the crisis. Now, Jordan started by instituting an immediate ban on all layoffs for formally employed workers. That seems to have worked, at least to protect Jordanian workers. As you know, Jordan has a large number of refugees and a large number of foreign workers who work informally and therefore would not have been covered by this ban on layoffs. But they'd also used their equivalent of Takaful and Karama, which is called the National Aid Fund and the Zakat Fund, to support poor families and informal workers with cash transfers. And in fact, Jordan had better percentage access to these workers than some of the other countries.
An application question on
Yes.
Jordan, because that sounds quite extreme, and of course, nothing like this was tried here in Egypt. Was some kind of furlough agreements attached to this, so that the government can pay the salaries along with the ban?
Yes, some companies got assistance to help with salaries, but generally the law was any formally employed worker could not be laid off. But they received basically the social insurance fund was able to support workers who are or companies that were in trouble in some sectors, especially tourism and sectors like that received assistance. Now, so Morocco, we had, again, they used the existing safety net to extend aid to families that were already receiving free and subsidized health insurance, which was quite an extensive social safety net that supported vulnerable families in Jordan. And they also had programs for laid off workers who were already on the social insurance system. So instead of banning the layoffs, they provided with additional assistance through the social insurance system.
He's mute.
Can you mute your mic, please? Yeah.
There was just a question about how did the layoff and the ban on layoffs affect productivity in Jordan? Was this exploited?
Well, it's hard to say. I don't know. That's more in-depth study is going to be necessary to look at that. That's and Tunisia had the most limited program time-wise. It was focused pretty much on the period from April to May 2020, where they had some support. But beyond that, they had what is referred to as a limited fiscal space. So they weren't able to really extend support much beyond that period. And you can imagine the Tunisian government was under a lot of fiscal pressure at that point. So basically, with this background in mind, I want to examine a number of outcomes in the labor market. First, we're going to examine the labor market status and how it changed. People who gained or lost employment, who became unemployed, and who entered and exited the labor force. So there's three outcomes: employment, unemployment, and out of the labor force. The monthly wage in the month prior to the interview. And basically, we take that and transform it into hourly terms with the hours per week variable that we have, so that we can at least distinguish between a decline in earnings due to a loss of hours versus a decline in earnings due to a loss in hourly wage. So we look at the hourly wage, and then the hours per week outcome is based on the number of hours in the week preceding the interview. Now, I start with showing you some descriptive statistics across time and country, and then we're going to turn this into a multivariate framework where the model will depend on the outcome of interest. So for example, when we're looking at the three employment outcomes, employed, unemployed, out of the labor force, we're going to look at the multinomial logit model that reports kind of the odds ratio of being in that state versus the reference state. The hours of work, that's a continuous outcome, but it has to be non-negative, which means that it's either zero or a positive number of hours, and we use what's called the Tobit model for that. And then finally, the hourly wages is just a log wage model with OLS. Now, I'm not going to show you a lot of tables and tables of regression coefficients. You can see those in the table in the paper if you want, but I will be showing you essentially predictions from these models. And we conduct two sets of models. The first one is a sort of pooled model where we put all the countries together, and we try just to compare how the experience of different countries was from each other over time. So we have the countries as well as the dummies for the waves of the survey, and an interaction between those two to try and get a sense of how the outcomes have been different over time for different countries. And then we have a second model where we do it country by country, in which we control for a whole bunch of covariates or characteristics, such as age, sex, and education of the worker, the pre-pandemic labor market status, in particular if they were informally employed or formally employed, the pre-pandemic industry of the worker, and the pre-pandemic either income or wage, depending on the model, where in the distribution of wages were they among the poorest, among the richest, etc. And every one of these explanatory variables is also interacted with the wave of the survey so that we can see how this particular characteristic changed the outcome over time. So were people at the low wages hurt initially and then they got better over time, or they stayed hurt compared to others the full time. So this allows you to look at how these characteristics affect the outcomes of interest over time.
Can I ask a clarifying question
Sure.
on the methodology? Were you hindered by the fact that there was a lot of missing variables for some of the countries and some of the rounds? How did you take account of the fact that maybe the data was slightly richer for some country or in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, the data was, we didn't substitute or try to impute values for missing values. So if data was missing, it was treated as missing. Sudan was in particularly problematic because not only was the conditions under which the field work being carried out in Sudan very difficult, but also there was rampant inflation, right? Inflation was something like several 100%. And so when you look at, we're looking essentially here at nominal wages, those could mean something very different in real terms. So Sudan in particular, but with the rest with other countries, I think the data quality is quite good. So not a lot of, yes.
Another question. Some reactions from the side of people, like in terms of migration, for example. So we know from South Asia, a lot of people who have been migrating, like the migrants from rural areas to urban areas, return back home.
Yes.
So this kind of stuff, for example, or like the other important issue, I don't know if you figured this out or not. Like in Egypt, they are giving people 500 pounds for 6 months, and then only less than 2 million people receive this out of 7 million pounds. Do we know if people know about the existence of such scheme or no, or they haven't applied for?
Yeah, actually, so in the descriptive analysis, we have questions like, what kind of support have you received and from where and which program from the government, and we list all the programs. So that you have data on, and we know what percentage of people got money from Takaful and Karama, what percentage got from the irregular workers cash transfer, etc. On that. And on the migration response, so there is a question on how did you cope with the crisis, and some of the answers there are I returned to my home village, or I migrated in response. But it is not something where we actually measure their location. Well, there may be a potential to do further analysis on that, because you've got their location at every wave of the survey, and so you should be able to tell whether they are in a different location or not. But there's plenty more questions like what you asked, which can be analyzed from the data. We just do the first cut right here. Yeah, go ahead.
Taking to the Egyptian efforts, do we know anything about how they affect the welfare of those unemployed?
We do. We have the employment status at every point in time, whether they're unemployed, whether they are informally employed in establishments or out of establishments. So while the main issue, though, to do causal analysis of how getting a particular type of assistance affected your welfare is much more complicated, because it's possible that the reason you applied for this welfare is because you were unemployed. And so there's a lot of selection issues that have to be worked out. And I have to say that this first cut analysis doesn't do that, but there's potential for somebody to do interesting work on this if you want to look at the causal impact of government support policies on particular outcomes. All right, so we, as I started saying, we produce predicted probabilities from these various models that correct for control for all of these different characteristics and look at various outcomes over time with some confidence intervals. the models, because there are lots of interaction terms and lots of variables, it's very hard to look at the coefficients of the table of coefficients and make a lot of sense. So that's why these predicted probabilities are useful. So now before we get into the multivariate results, let's show some descriptives. And here we're showing the labor force participation and employment rates for men and women. And you can see that generally they are lowest at the beginning, depending on which is the first round of the survey, and they rise with time, so that there is recovery in the labor force participation and employment rates, with the exception of Morocco in June 2021, where there is a dip in both employment and labor force participation. And that is because we think it's related to the cyclicality of agriculture in Morocco, and there is Morocco is suffering from a drought at the same time as the pandemic. But in other countries, there is an increase, and to a certain extent in Tunisia, there is a flattening out, but an improvement nonetheless in these rates. The unemployment rates go in the opposite direction. So you can see a decline in unemployment, of course, much higher unemployment rates for women than for men, but generally declining since the rise immediately post-pandemic, with, again, Morocco, things getting worse again in June 2021 compared to the previous quarters. Now, this is looking here at the experience of workers in terms of whether they experience a layoff or a suspension, so losing a job, even if it's for a short period of time, or whether they experience a decrease in earnings. And by type of employment you had pre-pandemic. So the rows here are what kind of employment you had pre-pandemic, and you can see that some workers are much less affected than others. If you're in the public sector, you're affected very little. You don't have very much in terms of layoffs or earnings declines. But other types of workers, like informal workers who work outside fixed establishments, that's the most vulnerable type of worker, this is looking only at wage workers, people who receive a wage or salary. And you can see that those workers were very heavily affected, especially in places like Tunisia and Egypt. And in fact, in Egypt, there was a slight worsening of their situation between February 2021 and June 2021. So these are the kind of the casual laborers that were being targeted by this new cash transfer programs. So, but nothing unexpected here. You see exactly what you expect to see, that the more informal and irregular your employment relations is, the more likely you're going to be affected negatively by the pandemic. This is a look at incomes. And here we're looking at households reporting a decrease in their income, either by more than 25%, by somewhere between 1% and 25%, stayed the same, increased, or increased by a small amount or by a large amount. And so I want you to focus on the very dark red bar here, which shows you basically the households experiencing a decrease in income, and by where your position in the income distribution was in February 2020. So the first, meaning you're the poorest quartile, the fourth, you are the richest quartile. And in general, you would see a pattern in which the biggest losses in income are among the poorest, and it declines thereafter, with a few minor exceptions, like in Morocco, where it goes back up from the third to the fourth. But you can see that for Jordan and Morocco in particular, the poorest households were affected quite strongly. 36% of them in Jordan, 54% in Morocco reported a decrease by more than 25% of their income. In Egypt, there's the same pattern of declines with income, but it's not as sharp as it is for the other countries. Now, So this is as far as the descriptive. Let me move on.
Do you have any idea about how big or small is that globally? I mean, you have, for example, in Egypt, about 50%. So the decline is,
Yeah.
Are these, Egypt looks like, about 50% experience decline in income.
Yeah, so what I reported earlier is that the studies that have compared income declines, they range from 8% to 87% of households having some income decline, so fitting into the two first bars, right? Some income decline. And the median country among those 16 that were studied was 66% having an income decline.
So can we say Morocco is the only country that is high by international standards?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Morocco, whereas Egypt, you had less than 50% having an income decline. But it ranges from 8 to 87, so pretty broad range.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So we know that there is something called labor market skill-based segmentation. So there's mid-skilled, high-skilled, and low-skilled jobs. These losses, were they mainly concentrated in one of these segments, for example, in high, or maybe along the lines of middle to low?
Yeah, it's mostly in the low to middle. The losses, so if I go back to these classifications, if you think about public sector as being high skilled in terms of education anyway, there tend to be more higher educated, and then the formal private, second highest in terms of skill. And then the informal usually is where the low and middle skills are. But and you can see that the biggest losses were in the informal private, both inside and outside. It has to do really with the type of job you have rather than your skill level. So if you're a construction worker and you are reliant on basically getting employment every day, and if there's no demand, you don't have a job, you're going to be affected more than if you are an employee in a government where you're told to stay home, but you still get your salary.
Sorry, I make a quick announcement just in the interest of time, and if some people want to write down the questions, there are some papers that are circulating. You can raise your hands and we can pick them up so I can combine the questions, because we might not have a lot of time for everyone to ask the questions. So please feel free to take it at the top of each, and we can pass those empty papers and please write your questions.
So I'm going to move next to the numbers that are predicted from the multivariate model. While these look like similar graphs as the one before, they're actually, the process of producing them is much more complex, because you estimate the model and you predict the probabilities, and there are actually around these probabilities, there are confidence intervals. They're small, which means that the predictions are relatively accurate, but you can see that generally these are the predictions. And so let me kind of summarize a little bit what we're getting. So employment rates increased over time, which means that there is recovery, right? So recovery over time in most countries. The only exception, again, being Morocco, where after the increase until April 2021, there is a decline in employment rate in June 2021. Now, workers outside the labor force were returning, and you can see that by a decline in the proportion of those out of the labor force in most countries, with the exception of Tunisia, where the rate of those out of the labor force seems to be increasing over time. So Tunisia, there was less of a return to the labor force, and in particularly it's among women that you see that happening. Women have to have a higher burden of the care economy, and if the economy, their kids are at home, etc., they might find it harder to return. And so that's, but the general pattern is for the proportion out of the labor force to decline. Now, unemployment shows a mixed bag, mostly a decline early on, and then a flattening out of the unemployment rate. But you do have unemployment increasing slightly in Morocco that we saw earlier in the descriptive statistics. So and Tunisia, you have a decline in the beginning and a flattening out of the unemployment. So not a lot of new insights from this, but at least the descriptive trends that we saw do hold up after you correct for a bunch of things. Now, we know that the public sector was the most stable work status and the most likely to persist, followed by the private formal sector. But other labor market states, like especially informal wage work and non-wage work, self-employment, unpaid family labor, were less stable. Jordan in general has shown more stability in employment status. So one can argue that the ban on layoffs in Jordan seems to have worked to some extent in protecting employment. Although one can criticize it as imposing too many costs on businesses, it seems to have done what it was supposed to do to protect formally employed workers. Morocco and Sudan show a lot more transitions and a lot more instability, and it's partly because of their agrarian economy and people moving in and out of agriculture, in and out of wage work into self-employment. And this is kind of the return to agriculture phenomenon that Ahmed was talking about, is very much clear in the case of Sudan and Morocco. Although Morocco also on top of that is experiencing this drought, which is creating for fewer employment opportunities in agriculture. But they do return to the village, so to speak. Now, initial income quartile pre-pandemic is not strongly related to employment status, but you can see that generally in three of the countries, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, the poor cannot afford to be unemployed. Remember, unemployed here is not working at all for a whole week. And the poor tend to be less likely to be unemployed because they have to find something to do. Whereas in Jordan is the only place where we saw that unemployment was common among all income groups. But that's not unusual. We find this idea that unemployment is essentially limited to the educated and relatively more well-off to be common even pre-pandemic. As far as predicted hours is concerned, you can see the patterns here. They're not all that strong. You have an increase in hours from the low of November 2020 in the case of Morocco, but a decrease in hours in Tunisia. So there's an opposite effect. Whereas in Egypt, there is just generally the amount of stability in hours, a bit of an increase over time. And in Sudan, much lower hours and declining over time. Now we were hoping to see a lot more happening here in terms of what is called time-related underemployment, people who are not able to work a 40-hour week because of lack of employment opportunities. Other data sources which look at this time-related underemployment measure have shown a big spike in that type of underemployment at the time of the height of the pandemic. So that this is one of the variables that picks up the inability to get jobs for people who are casually employed, and it picks it up. Yeah, the labor force surveys, for example, have picked that up. Yeah. Now, as far as wages are concerned, it's a mixed bag again. There is, in a few countries, you have slight increase in wages over time. And you see that in the case of Jordan and to some extent in the case of Sudan, even though this is nominal wages, so hard to say anything about what's happening for wages in Sudan. And in Tunisia, you see a slight increase and then a decrease in wages. And in Jordan, and in Morocco, there is this opposite effect that you see for employment. So what's going on in Morocco is a bit of a mystery. You see a decline in wages at the time when employment is recovering, and an increase in wages when employment is suffering. And I interpret that as a selection issue. Basically, as more of the low-wage workers who are marginally employed join the labor force, you see the average wage rate declining. As those low-wage workers leave the labor force, you see the average wage rate increase. So really what you see here in wages is almost purely driven by selection, by who's entering and exiting the workforce at any given point in time. You can see that basically there's relatively more stability during the recovery in Jordan and Egypt, a little bit more than in Morocco and Tunisia, and this exit and entry of informal wage workers seems to explain some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the case of Morocco. Now, what about wage inequality? Because we worry about pandemics, again, affecting wages unequally across the distribution. And here we see a big spike in inequality early on. So in November 2020, if you look at the ratio of the 75th percentile to the 25th percentile, so people at the top end of the distribution relative to people at relative to the bottom end of the distribution, you can see that there was a lot of inequality early on. And I interpret that not because wages actually changed, but because low-wage people exited and therefore created more inequality. And then as they come back in, the wage inequality kind of recovers to some extent. But generally, if there is more disequalizing changes early on, they do recover to some extent over time.
You're saying increases in inequality because people at the lower end are leaving?
Yes.
Compression in inequality.
No, what's happening is that if you have a lot of people with low wages and then some of them leave, then the people at the high end are clearer in the distribution, right? They're a larger portion of the distribution, so you see more inequality.
But in terms of a ratio, like a gap, like the gender gaps, usually you will find that the gap gets smaller, which used to puzzle us. It's because women and people at the lower end exit, right?
Yeah, but no, here it's really about who is showing up in these distributions. So if it's mostly, the majority are people with low wages, then it looks like more equal. But then as they leave, you get the people at the upper end who haven't left show more prominently in the distribution. Yeah. Okay, so just to conclude, we have clearly Egypt has experienced more moderate effects of the pandemic than its neighbors, and it's for a variety of reasons. We had, as I said, better pre-pandemic economic growth. We had a milder experience with the public health of the pandemic itself, fewer cases, fewer deaths on a per 1,000 or per million basis. We had relatively moderate closure policies that were sustained for a long period of time and consistent, probably less stringently enforced as well. So as we do things in Egypt, they're not always very serious about enforcement. And despite that, you see that while employment seems to have been relatively stable and protected, there are still persistent income effects. And so if you look at the Egyptian, a lot of Egyptian households are still, until June 2021, reporting pretty negative income effects from the pandemic. And so even you look at measures like well-being is still quite low for households by June 2021. So while the income measures don't seem to be affected too much, the employment measures, the income measures do indicate that there's some negative income effects persisting. The case of Morocco and Sudan, again, it's really a case where the agriculture sector, the rural sector is acting as a sponge, kind of taking back a lot of this population that tends to earn an income on a casual basis in urban areas when the economy does well, and tends to return home to rural areas during times of crisis. But of course, you add drought to that and exacerbates the story. Jordan, as we saw, managed to limit the labor market effects of the pandemic by instituting this layoff ban. But most of the informal economy in Jordan is populated by non-Jordanians. And so if you look at what happened to Syrians and other foreign workers, but primarily Syrians, they took a lot of the burden of the decline in employment that happened in Jordan. While we do have a Syrian subsample in this data, we didn't disaggregate for this kind of analysis, but I have a student currently working on looking at the differential experience of Syrians and Jordanians, and clearly Syrian refugees have experienced this pandemic much more adversely than Jordanians. Now, Tunisia is an interesting case because you see a relatively early recovery, and then there is a sort of a second downturn in the middle of 2021 as the pandemic resurges in Tunisia, and the government is very limited in its response. And you can explain why maybe that may have caused some of the political instability we have seen in Tunisia as the government really struggled to respond to the pandemic. But that's kind of as much as I'm able to say right now. So I will stop here. I have a few more charts and stuff to show you later if the questions bring them up.
Thank you so much, Ragui. Really We'll try to, stop as close as possible to 2 o'clock. But of course, some of us are not students, and some are graduates or students who don't have a class. Can I just see a hand show of any students who are still around? You're not skipping class for this. You don't have a class, right? Okay, because you're skipping class. We do have a class, but we're here. Okay, great. So carrying on with our classes because Gina teaches economics of Egypt. I teach economics of the Middle East and North Africa, and then we have quite a few labor classes. So this is highly relevant, and I'm sure there are more questions that can come. It's nice that we have a smaller debate now. We don't have to rely on the writing. I will try to just organize some of the questions I received from the Zoom session, as well as maybe when people were interrupting, I wanted to carry on questioning. Okay, so very, very interesting, up to date, and I'm sure Ragui would benefit from some comments on his ideas of developing this maybe into something more analytical. Because when you do a comparison across countries, you don't go enough in depth in some issues that actually came up even already in the suggestions. So I have quite a few questions on the protective measures and what we can learn, especially everybody who's interested in the Jordan experience, because they use something very different. So let me start with those. I think you spoke about the fact that the government tried to support this ban, but there was, several people would be interested, as reflected here, in, whether they regretted it at one point. Was there a backlash in terms of maybe, like instead of a rebound after the pandemic of firms hiring more workers, they might be actually starting to fire them now because they thought that some bad work practices started kicking in? Or maybe Jordan is one of those countries, because they're more formal, they also are embracing a new normal of work from home, and they can, the kind of policies that fit Jordan might not fit a more informal setup like Egypt or
Yeah, I think Jordan is an interesting case because they managed to extend formality to the Jordanians, at least in the economy, quite far. They went all the way to the very small firms. They extended social insurance coverage to them. And they also have a sort of segmented labor market in which much of the informal economy is populated by non-Jordanians, and that has served in the past as the shock absorber, so that a lot of the jobs that are in construction and agriculture, in sectors that are very cyclical and very liable to be affected by a slowdown in the economy, do not have or have a smaller fraction of Jordanians working for them. But, you know, in a way, Jordan did what Malaysia did during the Asian financial crisis. Remember, at that point, capital controls were a really bad thing, right? Nobody was going to adopt capital controls. Except Mahathir Mohamad, who adopted capital controls and didn't let people pull their money out. And Malaysia did very well during the Asian financial crisis relative to other Asian countries. I think Jordan probably can be said to have had the same. They did something which is a no-no in labor economics. Don't constrain employers' ability to lay off workers. It's true. In the long run, I think that's a good policy. But in the short run, subject to a big shock like that, it's probably not a bad thing to do. And I think that Jordan at least seems to have proven that point. Whether this slows down hiring post-pandemic or not, it remains to be seen. But I do think that that providing firms with some help to retain workers, as opposed to, this is what European countries have done, where they supported firms to retain their workers, as opposed to what the US did, allowed firms to lay them off and then provided unemployment insurance. But given that we don't have much of an unemployment insurance system, this seemed like the right thing to do.
Right. So, you know, this kind of relates to the, you know, questions also that were coming on the demand side. You know, I know this, you know, you've analyzed here mostly the workers' responses and the household responses. But are there any kind of insights about how the pandemic would have affected jobs or businesses?
Yeah.
I mean, can you detect a demand side contraction, you know, that has, you know, can explain some of those?
Yeah, I deliberately didn't discuss the data from firm surveys in this particular talk, but there is a policy brief specifically on how firms responded to the pandemic, which I recommend that the people check out. But basically what we saw is that again, within firms, size mattered, and micro firms were much more likely to close down during the pandemic. Small and medium firms were more likely to restrict hours and to use non-traditional ways to reach their clients through phones, through internet, through Facebook, through things like that. But revenue declines were also greatest among micro firms in most countries, except for Tunisia. For some reason, it's the small firms that had the greatest revenue declines. But the sectors that were most negatively affected are not surprising. Accommodation and food service, which is the tourism sector, that was by far the most negatively affected. Transportation was strongly affected negatively as well. And then other services followed. But things like
social services where women work, right? In Egypt, I think there were declines in wages in some of the social services.
Yeah, but public social services were not affected as much. So.
Right. I have, you know, I want to open up for further questions, please.
I have a question concerning the underreporting of numbers in Egypt. Do you think that the underreporting of the numbers has affected the intensity of the measures that we're taking in Egypt, and that this would data on have a negative or a positive effect on the Egyptian economy?
Look, I mean, I think there was definitely some underreporting in the number of cases in Egypt, but whether the number of deaths was underreported severely, I'm not sure. And even studies that looked at above normal deaths, which is just looking at all deaths and looking whether they're above normal, showed that in Egypt deaths were fairly moderate. So that the fact that Egypt had a somewhat more moderate experience with the pandemic than its neighbors, I think is sustained. But whether that contributed to the lack of need on the part of the government to take more extreme measures, maybe that's possible. But the thing is that the measures that the government did take were moderate and consistent in the sense that they did not go up and down the same way that they did in a place like Tunisia or Jordan. And I think that is, at least the economy was able to adapt to the consistency of these measures a bit better than having things open up and close down a number of times. So that I can say that even if it's underreported, it is more consistent than in other contexts.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that Jordan had the high stringency index. So how did they manage to ban layoffs, but at the same time everything was closed? So how did this happen?
Yeah, and that's why that period of very high stringency literally lasted about a month and a half. And then the prime minister lost his job over it, and the new one opened up.
The prime minister was a Labour economist, right?
Is an economist.
Social.
Omar Razaz, who was a great prime minister and good friend of mine, but he lost his job over how strict the closures were, and that's why they didn't last very long. So by essentially May of 2020, the things were opening up quite considerably, and then they had this big resurgence in cases. They tried to close up again, but despite that, they maintained the rule that no layoffs. Now,
Until now, yeah.
Yeah, I think until now they're pretty much under this. It's called defense law, so it's under military, so sort of a military rule that they were able to enforce.
That brings a lot of political economy questions, and us to teach classes on the region. Are we back to the state playing the role of employer of last resort, but not directly in the public sector by using the formal private sector as an arm of being an employer of last resort? And there were good reasons when this started in the 60s under Nasser in Egypt, and then it became a disaster. So yeah, I think there is this worry, right?
But one has to really distinguish between response to a crisis and temporary measures versus something that you keep forever as a way of so-called protecting workers. So I think Jordan so far has used this as a crisis response measure, but I doubt that they will retain this indefinitely. They may already have lifted it for all I know.
I think in all those kinds of analysis, just a response, in all those kinds of analysis on the pandemic, there's always the idea, are these transitory or are these permanent? And we're going into a new normal where the pandemic will never finish and the measures will never finish. And then we're trying as analysts to see what would be the trends that we think are going to stay with us maybe permanently and signal a change to the worse or to the better. So, I want to ask you specifically about that in relation to the dynamics of wages and unemployment and all that. But let me take this question.
Sure. So my question actually is a little bit out of the region, but because of what you mentioned. I'm thinking about the difference between giving people cash or basically through like supporting businesses or regulating businesses, forcing them to keep people employed. And the way I'm thinking about it is that if you give people cash, it's less distortive maybe, but also allows businesses to fail. And so sort of free market person in me wants to think that that's probably the most efficient way. If the business shouldn't be open and the government should allow it to fail. But on the other hand, if you can sort of look a few months down the line, a couple years down the line, and say this business is, or most businesses are after this pandemic is passed, still going to make sense. They should, they're still going to have a role. Then we are avoiding this kind of new lump sum startup cost that we would have to incur if we allowed the business to fail, or maybe if the individual actors was in their narrow individual interest to shut down at that point, but it would be against the societal interest because of all of these new startup costs that we're going to have to face. Is there data on, it sounds like what you said is that the US took more of the sort of like free market, give people cash approach, and the Europeans, maybe the Jordanians, took more of the keep the firms afloat approach. Has there been any information on which one of those was more successful or what the differences were?
You drink it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's recognize you here. So thank you, students.
Yeah, well, these are all great questions that I don't have full answers to. But so the US did not purely take the approach of allowing layoffs and giving people unemployment. They also had what's called the Paycheck Protection Program, where they give these loans to businesses that were forgiven if the businesses retain their workers. So that there was a combination of the two.
But so many people stopped working because the unemployment benefits were more valuable than the Paycheck Protection Program. And I know this was the case in a lot of small and medium-sized businesses in the US. It's just the employers couldn't keep people. I mean, they were screwing their employees if they kept them hired because they could be making more money.
That's right. And that, to me, is not very good policy because, as you suggested, the re-entry process is costly and has a lot of friction to it. And in fact, the US until today has not recovered the employment rate that it had pre-pandemic. And it's not because people don't want to hire, it's because people are still staying out of the labor force. So a lot of workers are just simply not coming back to the labor force. Older workers, maybe women with children, other groups that are still remaining out of the labor force. So it's probably better to keep workers in their jobs than deal with this entry and exit process where you have a lot of friction. But of course, you have to, as you suggested, there are certain businesses that are going to permanently fail. And you don't want to interrupt that process, kind of that creative destruction effect. And so, I don't know if in the case of Jordan, if a business that wants to close down, in that case, can lay off all its workers and close down, but they cannot stay in business and lay off some of their workers. That's the way the rule goes. But I do think that these are very important issues about how to manage a crisis, because a crisis is an opportunity for creative destruction, right? You have all the weaker businesses, sometimes that's the way they leave and you increase productivity that way. But those are very deep questions, and I don't think I have all the good answers for them.
May I follow up on what Jacob mentioned? I'm not sure if you were talking mostly about the costs of re-entry of the firms or the cost of re-entry of labor. Did you mean labor? Because I think he meant the firms, but I would like, as a labor, I want to take this further with regards to labor, because, I know the data has its problems here. It's, we have to wait and see what the actual national statistics show. But I find it very interesting, or if it's true that even female labor force participation seems to have picked up in 3 months, in this data. I mean, do you believe that? I mean, my understanding is that if women left because of discouragement and the double burdens, these do not go away so quickly, and I think this might be one of the long-term negative consequences of the pandemic with regards to participation of women and going into inactivity.
But the trend, even pre-pandemic in Egypt, has been for declining participation rate among both men and women.
Yes.
So that trend continues. What you find here is just that things dipped quite a bit in the second quarter of 2020 and in the third quarter, so they recovered a bit since then. But the general trend is still one for downward labor force participation, especially among married women and among young people in general.
And that's a discouraged worker effect because young people are even more discouraged now.
That's right.
Quality and the wages.
It's a delayed entry effect. They're shopping around longer for a job, and they don't feel compelled to take the first job that comes along. But I think that's an issue that requires a lot more study to understand why male participation rates in particular in Egypt are declining, despite the pickup in economic growth.
Right. Well, by pure labor economics, it's an income effect. If we were picking up, are men suddenly feeling richer in Egypt for some other reasons?
Well, it also has to do with expectations. If you have more educated people entering over time, they have higher expectations for the kinds of jobs that they would like to get, and they're more willing to wait for them.
I have another question if we don't, on the subject that, I would be interested in, which is wages and wage policy. I think a major conclusion of this study has been that quantity variables, employment, unemployment recovered, but there is an income effect or there is reduction in income losses. But am I right in thinking that this is mostly based on reporting of households, that they reported, self-reporting, that they're still feeling, they had income losses, and not so much on the wage data? Because I looked a little bit on the Egyptian wage data with the help of my colleague here, Ragui, and real wages seem to have recovered, based on this data for Egypt. I don't know how reliable it is, except for transportation and education for women or something like that. But they seem to have recovered. Do you think this is also a selection issue? Is there a contradiction between what the households are reporting and what the wages are showing?
Well, I mean, I think that households may be reporting the monthly earnings, which may be less because of less work available for casual workers. So it's not just a wage rate effect, but an earnings effect. And they could also be thinking about inflation, that there is kind of potentially more inflation that is eroding their wages.
Especially for the food prices.
Especially for food prices, which is not something that is captured very well by official inflation statistics. Mm-hmm. So those are the two things that households may be reporting. But you're right, it seems like the nominal hourly wage rate seems to be fairly stable.
Hourly, yes, but also monthly, actually, seen some rise. And that kind of also links with the package of policies and protection policies that have been considered in your paper and in general in the discourse and the discussion around the pandemic. A lot of talk about cash transfers, houses, and I think based on your results with the idea to people who are not working. We should also look at the working poor because the Takaful al-Karama, for example, tends to go for women who are household heads are not working, it needs to have a bigger coverage. Although,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that group of informal, irregular workers who are extremely vulnerable to any economic downturn. They feel a downturn in demand immediately in the amount of work that is available to them. So I think that group needs to have better access to better social protection measures, and Takaful al-Karama does play that role. However, you also hear stories of women who are receiving Takaful al-Karama not wanting to get a formal job because that comes with social insurance coverage, which will get their names struck down from the Takaful al-Karama list. So the government needs to be very careful about not creating disincentives for people to transition to formal employment by having things like you'd be eliminated from Takaful al-Karama if you get registered in the formal social insurance system. And so a lot of that sort of potential disincentive may exist.
Right, and I know how you feel about minimum wages, but that's the big story that is happening in.
How do I feel about minimum wage?
Then, you know, they don't apply to informal work. They cannot help people in the informal sector, but we have here Amal, you know, Amal IO, Amal Wafi, you know, yeah, she's AUC, but, you know, the long experience, I think, and, you know, quite knowledgeable about the ILO arguments that when you have a minimum wage, there is a lighthouse effect, and it also helps the working poor who are in the informal sector. So, you know, what do you think is the impact? I think Tunisia always had a working minimum wage. I don't see, I'm not sure if that helped at all in the adjustments, but Egypt only in January this year is going to have an effective high enough minimum.
And they did it completely wrong.
Yes, I know. They did it on monthly and not 2,400, right?
Yes.
2,400? 2,700, I think they do 2,700. Now again, okay, 2,000.
And why is it completely wrong?
Because it's not hourly.
Because it discourages part-time work, and therefore it's going to push women out of the labor force. And it had to be an hourly minimum wage. And the fact that they didn't take that into consideration makes me think that they have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, because I serve on that council, it's.
And I told you that, and you were supposed to have taken that message.
As academic experts with more of listeners than talkers, we can talk to them.
Yeah, I want to hear about it.
I mean, you don't have a minimum wage across the world. You have sectoral variances and geographical variances as well. So the sort of one minimum wage across the world could be disincentive for employers rather than an incentive.
That was brought up, but I think, you know, that the thing about the monthly, it was like a political number. You know, it's a number that is comparable to what's in the public sector. And they just wanted to pass the message that the private sector is going to be offering the same sort of protections as in the public sector. And that's where most of the discussion between the labor unions and the employer organizations have centered. But you're quite right. I mean, you know, but in the discussion, it was clear that for industries and for like, you know, construction and others, sectors of economic activity that pay in hourly, they're going to translate that into an hourly wage. You know, it's going to be 15 pounds per hour or something like that.
Yeah, but think about a factory owner who pays a monthly wage. Now they're going to have an incentive to get 48 hours a week of work from everybody because they pay a monthly minimum wage. That's a huge obstacle for women who cannot work 48 hours per week, right? So it's complete disincentive to have a more flexible work week, a shorter work week, etc.
Right, so you don't think the timing of it in Egypt is helpful very much in terms of the recovery of the labor market, helping the vulnerable groups that were hit by the pandemic?
The groups that are covered by the minimum wage are absolutely not the groups that were hit by the pandemic.
Right. Last word on the informal sector. You know, when you compare your countries, so Egypt is much more informal than in terms of the labor market than Jordan, and you know the recovery was quite good in Egypt. You know, do you think the informal sector then and the informal arrangements are a blessing during times of crisis, or are a bigger problem for adjustments?
No, I think they provide flexibility, but at the cost of social protection. So we need to find ways to maintain flexibility while providing social protection. And Takaful and Karama goes some ways towards doing that, but it doesn't go far enough.
Okay,
so I do think that you need to find ways to provide social protection in informal, flexible, or inflexible employment. So take the gig economy, for example. The gig economy is growing like crazy in Egypt. And it almost looks identical to the informal economy in terms of the social protection aspects of it. There's no reason for that because it's highly visible. The gig economy is people who get jobs through electronic platforms. I better define my words. Okay.
One of the things that I would just think of too, in the informal economy being this blessing is it might also just be that it's kind of like a black box and people's well-being or perhaps more actively their suffering is just less. It's not visible. And so maybe it looks like it's absorbing some sort of economic shock, but really it's just.
But actually, we do see them in our surveys. So the surveys cover everybody, whether you're informal or formal in the form. So that's and when we ask questions about income and well-being and employment, we do ask everybody, and we see very clearly that they are much more strongly affected by a downturn than people in the formal economy. So,
are there any more? An hour and a half, and thank you so much for being able to stay, but I understand that some of you might need to go to classes. So we're going to end the formal meeting now around this discussion. Ragui, however, is staying for at least 1 more hour, an hour and a half on campus, and we'll stay in our lovely Dr. room. You know, it's a very luxurious room, and there are some cookies there. You're very welcome to come and talk to him and book an appointment. Or if you'd like to talk to him personally, or about research or application to graduate work or any of that sort. But other than that, thank you so much for being here, and I hope this will be the start of many times of interacting with Ragui and others.